Hey guys, welcome back. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and We Buy Guns in Westfield, Indiana, and you are watching Marksman TV. Welcome back to another weekly used gun review. If you guys do come back to this channel often and enjoy these videos, please let me know by hitting that subscribe button. It really does help us in the YouTube algorithm. Now, in these videos, we take about 6 used firearms that have come into our store, either through the front door or our website, and give you guys about a 3 to 5 minute review of each to give you guys an idea of some stuff out there on the market. Remember, the point of this video is not to sell anything, just to keep in accordance with YouTube's policies. We're making these videos strictly for entertainment and educational purposes only. So with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into it now. Alright guys, this video is brought to you by our website, We Buy Guns. If you're interested in selling a firearm or firearms collection, you can log on to our website, create an account, and submit your firearms for an offer request. With that offer, you will get a printable offer certificate, which you can take with you to a competing gun store in your area to try and leverage yourself a better deal. If you cannot get a better deal, go ahead and sell them to us. We do provide you with a shipping label, and we will pay you with an ACH direct deposit or paper check, your choice. And it is through our website that we source most of the firearms that you see in these videos. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into this. Remember, the format of these videos is we start with most common and move through least common as the video progresses, starting us off with our first firearm. Now, I actually have a couple of these. These are Russian model 1895 Nagant Revolvers. They are a double single action gas seal revolver, and I'll talk a little bit about the importance of that. Now, this particular one comes to us from a local customer. This one was sent to us from a customer in Illinois, so thank you so much for selling these to us. Now, the story would really begin prior to the 1890s when Russia is issuing the Smith & Wesson No. 3 pattern revolver in .44 Russian. Now, we know sort of during the mid-1860s, the United States is seeing further advancement in arms technology, especially when it comes to self-contained cartridges, both in rifles and handguns. Now, Smith & Wesson was one of the leaders in this type of development when they would come out with the No. 3 large frame pattern top break revolver. And that would compete with things like the 1873 single action Army from Colt. And both of those revolvers would see a lot of success in the United States. Now, the No. 3 pattern would get the attention of Russia, who would actually, Tsar Nicholas would come over from Russia, take a look at the No. 3 pattern and decide that he would want it for the Russian military. Now, first they would contract with Smith & Wesson to make a large number of these. Smith & Wesson would, start fulfilling these orders. But very quickly, Russia would move out, go to other arms manufacturers who would basically more or less copy the design, leaving Smith & Wesson holding the bucket on these big orders that were being purchased, and would actually put Smith & Wesson in some dire straits when it came to being able to maintain the solvency and viability of their company. Now, the great thing about the No. 3 revolver, it was the first sort of modern step in the new type of technology that a lot of militaries would start adopting moving through the late 1890s. However, one of the biggest problems with the No. 3 pattern was it was very large, complicated, and difficult to manufacture, even for Russia, who was using less expensive contractors who had more or less copied the design. So by the 1890s, Russia is looking at revamping its military armaments. One of the things, of course, they would want to replace is the, service issue sidearm. Now, in 1891, we know that Russia had adopted the Model 91 Mosin Nagant rifle, and if we listen to the name Mosin Nagant, it was Leon Nagant, who was part of the force sort of responsible for the development and implementation of that rifle. Now, since Leon Nagant did have an audience with Russia, he had started working on this new design of this type of revolver that was actually more related to the single action Army. Again, I'll talk about that in a minute. And he had been working on it in Liège, Belgium. Now, Russia was also interested in this technology, and by 1895, they would actually officially adopt the 1895 Nagant revolver and replace the No. 3 Smith & Wesson in military service. Much easier to produce. They could put these out on larger scale because they were smaller. They were a lot easier for officers or whoever was issued a sidearm to carry. Now, what you effectively have here is a revolver chambered in 7.62 by 38R, R standing for rimmed. It was an interesting cartridge as the firearm, the projectile, I should say. The projectile itself was actually recessed down into the casing. This, along with the gas seal nature of this revolver, and what that effectively means is the cylinder will actually advance up into the forcing cone right in here. If you see, as I sort of pull the trigger, it's a very heavy double action, the cylinder will move forward into the forcing cone. Then as I release, it will move back. Now that creates a total gas seal. On most revolvers, gases are escaping out the side of the front of the cylinder face. And this, to my knowledge, is the only revolver that can actually be suppressed as a result of that gas seal. And then having the projectile recessed down into the casing itself further aids in that sort of gas seal type of concept. Now, these would stay a standard issue in Russian service through the World War I era, the Russian Civil War, the Finnish Winter War, because in the late 1920s is when Stalin is looking to revamp the armaments of Russia. They move into a handgun trial in 1929. Now, they had been looking at moving into semi-automatic rifle technology with the SVT-38 later in the 1930s. And they had even revamped or even redesigned the Model 91 Mosin rifle in 1930, giving it the designation 9130. Now, in 1930, they also came up with a semi-automatic pistol known as the TT-30. It was a Tokarev design, and further revamped the design in 1933, giving it the name the TT-33. But by the time the Finnish Winter War and later World War II would come about, there would not be nearly as many of those in Russian service, so they would still continue to issue the 1895 Nagant Revolver as the primary issue sidearm, using the TT-30s and TT-33s as ancillary sort of hole fillers where they could be issued. Very interesting revolvers with a very long history. Now, if we look at the pricing on these have been coming into the country for quite some time. I knew that back 2010, 2011, big shipments of these were coming in, and they were dirt cheap. You could get these with the holster, cleaning rod, and lanyard for about $100 or so, even less in some cases. Now the pricing on these has actually gone up quite a bit. Here we have one made by Tula in 1944. This one also made, 1935. So pre-World War II, and this one was made during World War II. Of course, the pre-war ones are going to be worth a little bit more, but these have gone up steadily in value. Typically, you're seeing them on the very low end at about $300, and on the high end at about $600. Most of them are import marked. If you find one without import marks, they can get upwards of around the $1,000 mark. So here are these two examples. Very nice. This is larger Century Arms import marks here on the right hand side of the frame. This one has a very discreet import mark, also Century Arms on the barrel. Beautiful finish on this one, especially this one looks like it was dipped in a typical sort of post-war Russian refurb type finish like you see on the Russian capture K98s. But anyway, very interesting revolvers. If you get a chance to look at one of these for the money, it is a really good piece of history, especially if you're trying to put together a World War II era firearms collection. So definitely worth taking a look. Happy to get those in and share them with you. Okay, up next is a popular pistol coming to us from a customer in Wisconsin. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a Ruger P91 DC, the DC standing for decocker. This particular one is chambered in 40 Smith & Wesson. It is a semi-automatic pistol feeding from a detachable box magazine. It is double single action and, as mentioned, has a decocker here, which is an ambidextrous control. Now, the story with this would actually begin in 1985 with Ruger's introduction of the P series of pistols, and this was arguably Ruger's first real introduction into a full semi-automatic handgun line intended for military and police and commercial use. Now, the line was released or debuted with the Model P85, which was a 9mm pistol, built on an investment cast frame, very large like this, and was actually intended for submission to Aberdeen Proving Grounds for the Joint Service Handgun Trial that was happening through the 1980s. Now, those trials took place over 3 consecutive sessions through the 1980s, starting at about 1981 and ending in 1988, in which different submissions for a new pistol would be issued or sent to the United States military, and they were looking to replace the then used 1911. Ultimately, we all know the Beretta 92 series was adopted as the M9. Now, this was not actually manufactured. I should say the P85 was not manufactured in time for the first 2 sessions of the trials, but it was for the third. Now, in the third the third session of set of testings, the P85 actually performed and met all of the military's requirements for that trial. However, the M92 from Beretta was well down the road of being accepted. And ultimately, even though the P85 did very well, the military still went with the M9 pistol or the Beretta M92 as the M9 pistol. Now, it did meet the 20,000 round requirement. It was very rugged, very durable, and that's really what these are known for. They're built like tanks, and that's kind of what your trade-off is it's heavy, it's bulky, it's cumbersome, it's large, but they are known for their reliability, accuracy, and they're just really freaking durable, and that's why people like them. So even though the military never accepted them, the commercial market, especially through the late 80s or early 90s, fell in love with these pistols, mainly because of their price point. They were also very affordable. And you have other, 1990s era semi-automatic pistols out on the market. Glocks are emerging and things like that. But the Rugers were actually very, very light on the wallet and very affordable, again, even compared to like Smith third generation semi-autos as well. So a lot of people would purchase these, and these actually found their way in law enforcement departments as well. Now, over their existence, they were manufactured between 1985 and 2013, and they were made in many different models. In 9mm, they were the model P85, P89, P93, P94, and P95. The P95 would come about with the polymer frame, getting away from the investment casting. Now, in 40, you had the P91, which is what this is, and the P94, and the P91 here is really the 40 caliber version of the P89. P89 saw some improvements over the original P85 design, larger controls, things like that. And then in 45, that was the P89, the P90, the P97, and the P345. I actually recently had a P345 in here. I would have loved to have still had it for the video. So they were ultimately replaced by the SR series of pistols, which actually is one of my favorite semi-automatic handgun lines from Ruger. But these definitely, a lot of people bought these through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So, there are a lot of, people who look for these for nostalgic purposes. On the market today, they are still very affordable. You should be able to find these in about the $300 to $400 range in most cases. So, again, for the money, if you're on a budget, these are excellent handguns. They are reliable, and they are a lot of fun on the range. And they do take a lot of cues from the SIG P220 manufacturer practices, as well as the 1911 with the tilting barrel system and the little linkage here. So, good pistol, proven design. Happy to get this in and share it with you guys. Okay, up next is a very popular pistol coming to us from a viewer in Pennsylvania. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a CZ Shadow 2. This is the orange edition of the pistol, obviously, as the color would suggest. And the CZ Shadow 2 is based off of the very popular CZ Model 75. Now, the Model 75 would come about in 1975, as the name would suggest, in current-day Czech Republic. Now, at the time, it was intended to be a replacement for their military and police sidearm, which at the time they were using the CZ Model 82, which was loosely based off of the Russian Makarov design, but chambered in the same round of 9x18mm Makarov. They had a 380 export version known as the CZ83. Now, although it would take some time for this to make a splash at home in the Czech Republic, it would see a lot of use and favor in military and police forces around the world, most notably in places like Israel, for example. Some of its design elements that were very popular were the slide fitting inside of the frame, which kept a very low bore axis, which led itself to very good recoil impulse and low muzzle flip. Now, through the 80s, the 90s, and 2000s, the CZ75 has gained a lot of respect and a lot of popularity, and is probably in the top 5 favorite category of most people when it comes to their full-size pistols that they prefer to shoot, and it has somewhat of a big cult following. So, throughout the 2000s, the CZ70 line has expanded into things like the combat models, the SPO1s, and of course the Shadow series. Now, the Shadow series from CZ was released in 2020 and has been marketed as their ultimate competition-ready firearm. So you could go into a gun shop, pick one up off the shelf, and go to your favorite IPSC match or any related firearms competition, and you should do pretty well with the Shadow 2 series. Now, they have 2 basic lines of this. They have the blue and the orange, denoted by the color of their grips. Now, the blue is more of the base competition model of the Shadow 2, and the orange is the more loaded model, if you will. The orange does feature a barrel bushing here. The slide and the frame are actually factory hand fit to each other, so you have much tighter lockup. There's actually zero movement between the two, so the fitment between the two halves of the pistol are very precise, and it has a factory tuned trigger. So even though the Blue Series Shadow 2 has a nice trigger, this has a cleaner, shorter break and a shorter reset. This puts the price up maybe about 40% over the blue, but both of them are very well respected pistols. Now, if we look on the used market today, the orange model like this is selling used in excellent condition between about $1,500 and $1,600, whereas the blue I'm seeing hovering around $1,000. So depends on what your budget is and how much further you want to go. Both models do feature a similar feature set in terms of what their base components are. You have these aluminum grip panels. The size, weight, and balance is the same. You have a blacked out rear adjustable sight with a fiber optic front, rear and front side serrations, manual safety here, front and back strap checkering, and an accessory rail here with a match barrel. So they are beautiful handguns. You have an adjustable magazine release as well. So it would really serve a lot of people well for competition shooting. So anyway, not much else to say about it, but that is the CZ Shadow 2. Okay, up next is a very popular variant of the AKM that comes to us from a local customer. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is the Polish Tantal, or the model WZ88 as it was adopted in Poland. Now, the story with this really began back in 1974 with the Soviet Union adoption of the AK-74, which is their first variant firing the 5.45x39 cartridge, which was an evolution off of the 7.62x39. Now, Russia wanted to go to a smaller caliber, higher velocity round due to the United States showing success with the 5.56 cartridge with its ballistic advantages over being able to carry more ammunition, having less recoil, a faster velocity, and actually the fragmentation effect of the round as it impacted the target, and the higher instances of lethality or mortality on the battlefield against enemy combatants. So with the adoption of the AK-74, Poland being very much tied into the same type of lineage of arm development as the Soviet Union, Poland had also thought that it would also be moving into the new 5.45x39 round. Now in 1980, Poland begins doing research on the cartridge and would commission its local arms factory at Radom to start developing a new variant of a new rifle that would house this new cartridge. By 1981, 1982, they started coming up with prototypes. Now, Russia had variants of the AK-74 that it would produce and manufacture for Poland if it wanted it, but Poland, like Romania, and we talked actually about the Romanian AIM-74 a couple weeks ago, Poland wanted to basically control its own destiny on its domestic arms manufacturing. It had more control over the design and implementation of the rifle as well as the cost structure. So they would actually focus more on the AKM design on the 7.62x39 and try to make changes to fit it into the 5.45x39 cartridge, which is again what Romania had done. Now, if we look at the standard AKM and the AK-74, there's actually not a lot of parts interchangeability, but with the new Polish sort of WZ88 design, they wanted to, again, incorporate a lot of elements off of the standard AKM pattern, and they also simultaneously, at the same time, wanted to have somewhat of a relative amount of parts interchangeability with the standard Soviet model of the AK-74. So they would get to the drawing board again and come up with what would be landed on as the ultimate final pattern design in 1988 adopted as the WZ88. Now it would actually go into production in about 1989-1990 and enter Polish military service in 1991, but would be discontinued from military service in Poland in 1995. Remember, in 89, the Berlin Wall has fallen, the Soviet Union is dissolving, and Poland starts to look at an alternative military path for them, so they start really kind of going in accordance with NATO and would start standardizing on a 5.56 cartridge by the late 1990s. Now, the original design did have a wire fold stock. This one has a fix. This is actually a Russian red stock, pretty valuable stock, but the original design would have this. Although this sort of Bakelite handguard is in a two-tone configuration and looks like sort of a hodgepodge that was maybe thrown on by a previous owner, this is actually the original furniture kit that would have been on a Polish Tantal. And then you have, of course, the AK-74 brake, but this is a little bit different in design as well, with the provisions for a grenade launching ring up here at the front, as they wanted to launch grenades off the front of the rifle as well. Now, as these would start being decommissioned and sold off through the late 1990s and early 2000s, Polish Tantal parts kits would start coming into the United States. Now, you would have companies like Century Arms International as well as InterArms taking these parts and constructing them. Now, InterArms would use the AUSA receivers from Armory USA out of Houston, Texas. That is not what this is. Even though that's actually what this receiver is, the InterArms ones are not only marked InterArms, but noted by having a Parkerized finish on them. This actually has sort of the correct black enamel or black type paint finish, so this is how it would look. I know that Armory USA also manufacture their own for distribution, which is what I believe this is based on its configuration. Of course, the receivers could have been made by or used by home builders on the kits as well. Century Arms versions of the Tantal are the least desirable. Through manufacturing processes, they were deemed to not be as reliable, and they had early on keyholing issues. So on the market today, the Century build Tantal kits are not as desirable, but even those are selling right now used for about $900 to $1,200 or so on the used market, depending on what they come with. But usually the inner arms or the Armory USA versions are going excess of, I'd want to say about $1,400, $1,500 or so plus. So really interesting firearms. Happy to get this one in and share it with you guys. Okay, up next is a gorgeous rifle that comes to us from a local customer. This is a Henry original model. It's a modern production, but it is based off of the original Henry 1860 model. Now, Benjamin Tyler Henry was the designer of this rifle, and it had very heavy influences off of the volcanic pistol, especially the toggle link loading system, which would stay with lever action rifles all the way through the model 1873. Now, the 1860 would be the first in a very long line of very successful repeating rifles. Self-contained rifle technology and even lever action style rifles did exist at the time of the development of this, but this sort of package and this type of configuration is what would stay strong through the 1860s all the way up through the 1890s, which would bring in Marlin and even some sort of Colt slide action type technology as well. But this would be the springboard for all of those advancements through the late 1860s. Now, as again the name would dictate, this came about in 1860, 1 year just before the American Civil War of 1861. Now, this was deemed to be sort of the new future of military technology. It was the rifle you could load on Sunday and shoot all week long. However, the militaries were very slow to adopt to this type of technology. This did see some use in the Civil War, such as notable instances like Little Bighorn, but by and large, these are widely avoided by military use, but did see a lot of popularity within civilian populations. Now, the 1860, this was a 44 rimfire. You would feed it by bringing the follower tab all the way up to the end and then rotating the barrel assembly over, and then load your rounds in through the front. You would then close this, and the follower tab would follow behind the rounds as they were fired, so you would have to reposition your hand. Obviously, there's no wooden handguard here, and there's no loading gate system on the side, so this is obviously the first attempt. Now, Benjamin Tyler Henry is developing this, and he would get the attention of Oliver Winchester, who was a shirt designer at the time. The two would join forces to produce and distribute this rifle. Now, a couple years later, in 1866, that's when you would get the biggest sort of evolution of this, which you would see things like the incorporation of a handguard and the very important development of the King's patent loading gate, so you could load through the side of the rifle and you didn't have to use this awkward loading system. Also, you have a handguard here, so you can kind of protect yourself from heat and things like that. Those design changes would stay with the 1873, the 1886, so on and so forth until, you get to the final real design iterations, the 1892 and 1894 rifles, which are still even used today. So a really interesting history. I am a huge fan of the 1860. Now, if we take a look at specifically what this is, now, about, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, Henry came out with this modern Henry, which is actually not the same as the original Henry companies. Modern Henry Company came out with the original Henry. Of course, it is the 1860 Action as discussed. Now, this uses really nice, beautiful wood. You get them in a brass. You can get them in a color case hardened frame as well. Most of the original 1860s were in a brass frame. They did make a few in an iron frame with the color case hardening. But by and large, most of what you see as the original 1860s had brass. 24-inch sort of octagonal barrel, if you will, and this is all one machine piece, the magazine tube and the barrel. Now, they would distribute these in the base model, such as this. They're about $2,400, $2,500. They have a deluxe version with engraving that goes for a little bit more than that. On the used market today, these reproductions are selling for about $1,500 to $1,700, depending on condition and what they come with. If you find an original model 1860, those are insanely expensive. On the low end, I've seen them at auction at about $60,000. On the high end, well over $100,000, depending on their condition. Not very many of them were made. Anyway, very interesting rifle with very interesting history. Very happy to get this one in and share it with you guys. This beautiful Henry original based on the original 1860. Okay, last but not least, we have a very collectible and a really nice example of an original 1903 A4 rifle manufactured by Remington, which would have served as the principal sniper rifle, or DMR, designated marksman's rifle, for the United States Army in the latter half of the Second World War and beyond. Now, Remington as well as Smith Corona were the primary arms manufacturers when it came to production of the 03A3 rifle, which was a modified version of the original 1903 Springfield, which served in the First World War. Now, through the interwar period, there were some revisions that were made to the rifle. Of course, we have the Pacific Theater, where old antiquated technology is being issued to the United States Marine Corps. So quickly they wanted to make some revisions to the design. Remington would come up with some improvements to simplify the manufacturing by going to stamped parts, also by moving to a rear adjustable aperture sight here on the rear of the receiver ring. So Remington was already really scaled up with manufacturing a lot of the 03A3 rifles. Now, the United States Army had been interested in getting a DMR. The Marine Corps had been using an original 1903 with a unilateral scope. The Army needed something similar, so they went to Remington and said, okay, can we take the original 03A3 pattern and modify it for the sniper roll or the DMR roll? Now, Remington at first was not really interested in this contract. They had already been manufacturing, the 03A3 rifles and other war material as well, so they weren't really interested in trying to go out and find subcontractors for the scopes and the mounts and things like that they would need to make a proper rifle. So the government said, okay, don't worry about the scopes and the mounts. We will source those. Just take the rifles and slightly modify them for, allowing, clearance on the bolt, for example, for the scope and modifications like that. So continuing with the production, Remington would start manufacturing rifles for this purpose in 1943. They were only manufactured by Remington. They were not manufactured by anybody else, and they were manufactured between 1943 and 1944. Some of the things they would do is they would omit the inclusion of the front sight. So although the top of the barrel would be cut for the front sight, no front sight would ever be added. So if you ever see markings that look like a front sight was ever there, you know that it was not an original 1903 A4 barrel. Of course, this one's also marked Remington Arms with an RA and flaming ordnance bomb cartouche, and was manufactured in September of 43, which would put it right in line with the manufacture of these. There's also the punch marks for accuracy, acceptance, and things like that. Now, on the right-hand side, they had to put a relief cut for the downswept bolt handle, which the downswept bolt handle would have to clear the scope. The proper cuts, you can look at pictures online to really tell the difference between something somebody has done with a Dremel and something that was properly done at an arsenal, and this one was properly done. They are manufactured by Springfield and Keystone, the stocks were. You would have a K and the disconnect cutout channel here, which this one has for Keystone, or an S for Springfield. This one's a Keystone. You would have your Remington acceptance marks and ordnance wheel, and your inspector Frank James Atwood FJA on the left-hand side. This one went back for re-arsenaling at Augusta Arsenal, so it's marked AA, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. You would have your 5 subcontractor markings here, which this one also has. Now, this would have originally, as I mentioned, the government would look for scopes. First, they went to Lyman and would adopt the Lyman Alaskan as the M70 scope. Now, a lot of people think, that was the one that was most predominantly used, and it actually was not. They only delivered about 200 units of those, but they were unable to get enough glass from the glass subcontractor, so they switched over to Weaver and adopted the 330C scope as the M73B1. The M73B1 is what served on 99% of 1903 A4 rifles that were issued in the Second World War. Now, that is not what this scope is. This is an M84. Now, as I mentioned, this went back to Augusta Arsenal for overhaul, as marked Augusta Arsenal on the left-hand side of the stock. It went back to overhaul after the Second World War had concluded, like most of these did, and was reissued with a more modern M84 scope for the Korean War. It's the same scope that they used on the M1D and M1C sniper rifles, based on the M1 Garand action, if you will. So, an original 1943 produced by Remington, a 1903 A4 rifle, likely was originally issued with an M73B1, went back for overhaul at Augusta Arsenal, where it got the more modern M84, and probably went back to Korea, then came home and ended up in some of these collections. That's likely the lineage of this, but an all correct and original rifle. Also, the serial number would have been offset to the right-hand side here, but the model designation 1903A3, the military never stamped them A4, would be offset to the left-hand side here. So if an original 1903A3 action was repurposed, those markings would be underneath the scope mount. The scopes were made by Redfield and marked on the right-hand side here. Again, were sourced by the government, not by Remington. So Very interesting rifles. Now, if we look at the market today, these are climbing up there in value. A original rifle like this in excellent condition would probably start at about $4,000. Now, the rifles with the original M73B1 scopes that were never overhauled are going to be worth more money. I've seen those top between $5,000 and $7,000 depending on condition. It's like an M1 carbine with the original World War II, barrel band without the bayonet lug, and the original flat bolt and original 2-rivet handguard. Same thing here, the original scopes and things like that didn't go back for overhaul, going to be a little bit more collectible. But an original 1903 A4 in any configuration that is authentic, they're typically starting around $4,000. So this is just a great example. There are some that have been obviously sort of fantasy builds. People have taken 1903 A3s and just put scopes and stuff on them. So look out for that. And then Gibbs, which doesn't manufacture them anymore, did a really good reproduction of these with Chinese manufactured scopes. I believe the scopes that came on the Gibbs were the Chinese ones. I can't remember. But those are actually, if you find those are going, between $1,000 and $2,000 as well, plus, even though those are reproductions, but those are a really good reproduction. But this is an authentic, very cool, happy to get in and share it with you guys, and we will end the video with this one. Well, that is all the time I have for you today on these. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. If you enjoyed, please let me know by hitting that like button. Please also consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell notification button so you are aware when I am posting new content. I'm going to leave you guys off with that. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports, and we buy guns in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV, and I will see you next time.